Hey everyone, my name is Anson and we're back with a brand new video. In this video, I'm going to teach you all how to set up and use mock service worker in your project, in your front-end project specifically. So we're going to be using React with JavaScript, and I'm going to talk a little bit about what exactly mock service worker is and why you should use it. So really all mock service worker is just a library that allows you to mock out your API. So for example, let's say you're building an application and you want to first focus on your front end code, your front end application first. But a lot of times in order for your front end application to work, you need the back end. So you might be overwhelmed having to, set up a front end project and then set up a back end project. With the mock service worker, on the other hand, you don't need to set up an entire Express.js project right away. You can use the mock service worker to mock out the entire API itself, okay? And then the React or your front-end application can just use whatever data fetching library you need to use, call the API as if it was calling the real API, and then what mock service worker does is it intercepts those requests and it just returns the mocked response. Okay, so this is really great because one, you don't have to actually worry about creating a bunch of mock data yourself by importing JSON files and then removing them when you don't need them anymore. All you have to do is just write your code on the front end the way that you normally would, call your API the way that you normally would, and just let the mock service worker intercept the request and just return the mock response. So the mock service worker will pretty much intercept the request and prevent it from actually hitting the real API. Okay, so this makes it very great for speeding up development for the front end, and it's also actually really good for writing unit tests as well. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. Okay, we'll take a look at some examples, but first, I will mention that everything that I'm going to be doing in my project, I will leave a link in the description to a GitHub repository. So in case you get stuck or lost somewhere in the video, you can reference the code and you can use that to kind of like aid yourself in following the video. The other thing is, if you have any questions, feel free to leave a comment down below. I'm very active in my YouTube comment section, so I'll answer the question in the YouTube comments. Okay, so hopefully all that makes sense. What I'm going to do is I'm going to set up my React project using Vite. I'm going to be using JavaScript specifically, mainly because I know that there are a lot of people still using JavaScript and not TypeScript. And I understand that the type annotations can be a little bit tricky to work with. And I think that if you use TypeScript, you should be easily able to translate from JavaScript to TypeScript. But the other way around can be a little bit tricky because the people who know JavaScript don't really know about the type annotations, but if you already know TypeScript, that implies that you know JavaScript already. So don't click away from the video just because we're using JavaScript. Feel free to continue watching and follow along. And like I said, it shouldn't be difficult to do the translation from JavaScript to TypeScript. Okay, so let's go ahead and I'm going to set up the project and I'll see you guys when I'm done with that. Okay, so I have just created my project, have all my node modules installed. The next thing that we need to do, of course, is install the mock service worker package. We're going to install it as a dev dependency because typically you don't want to use this library for production because you don't want to do any mocking for the production environment. You want to actually have the production environment calling the actual production API itself. So your production front end that is deployed to whatever cloud server you're using needs to call the actual production API. So I'm going to type npm i-d msw. Let me zoom in just a little bit so you all can see better. So npm i-d msw. Okay, that should not take too long to install. But there's a couple things that we have to do to set this whole thing up. Once the package has been installed, we need to actually get the mock service worker script into our public folder. So we can very easily do this by running a command. So let me just clear this out. So I'm going to type npx msw me just expand my terminal. Init, and we want to provide the relative path to this public folder right over here. So since the public folder is in this root directory React with MSW, I'm just going to do public and hit tab to autocomplete it. And then when I hit enter, you'll see that it says initializing the mock service worker at the path. Service worker successfully created. You need this file, otherwise the service worker will not work. So this is the first thing that we need to do. Go ahead and just press yes to this question over here. Do you wish to save public as a worker directory? And then hit type Y and then hit enter. And then we're done with that. And now you should see this mock service worker.js file in the public folder. Okay, and there's a bunch of stuff. You don't have to worry about this. So just click X from that. Okay, so now the next thing that we need to do is we need to actually set up the actual worker itself. And we're going to set up the worker for the browser because we are setting this up for React. There are situations where you want to set this up in a Node.js server-side environment. So for example, when you are writing unit tests, and you want to mock out those API calls, you can set it up for the server environment. In our situation, because we are setting this up for React, so that way our React application can actually call the API and get the mock response, we're setting up for the browser in this situation. So hopefully that makes sense. Okay, but what we're going to do is we're going to go into the source folder and we're going to create a new folder called mocks. Everything related to mock service worker will be inside this folder. So I'll create a new file called browser.js, and this is where I am going to import this setup worker function from msw/browser, just like that. What I'm going to do next is I'm going to create and export a variable, or I'm going to create this variable, and then export it like this. Export const worker equals, and I'm going to call setup worker, just like that. And setup worker is going to take in an array of handlers, but we need to make sure we use the spreader operator like you see over here when we pass it in. So I'll show you how that works. So let's go to our mocks folder again, and let's create a new file called handlers.js. And inside this file, we're going to import a couple of stuff from MSW. We're going to import HTTP. Okay, and we're going to also import HTTP response. So this HTTP import will allow us to access the different HTTP methods that we want to handle. So I'm going to do the same thing that I did with the worker. I'm going to create a variable and export it, but this variable will be called handlers. And this is just going to be an array. And inside this array is where we will set up our individual handlers. So if I want to set up a get request handler, and when I say handler, what that means is it's going to handle the interception of the request. So whatever request that you want to mock, you need a handler for it. So I'm going to reference HTTP. You'll notice that when I use the dot operator, I see a bunch of these different, these are actually methods, but for some reason they're highlighted as properties, but they're actually methods. So I can reference get, I can reference head, options, patch, post, put, all, delete, but I'm going to use get, and I'm going to invoke it by using the parentheses. And you'll see that it expects two arguments that are mandatory, the path and the resolver. And if you need to pass in options, you can. But the path, of course, is going to be the endpoint that we want to intercept, that we want to mock. So I'm going to go ahead and pass in /API/users. Okay, so I'm going to make a request to /API/users in the React app, and then this handler will take care of intercepting that request, and it's going to return the mock response. So the way that we return a mock response is we do that inside the resolver function, which is this second argument over here, which is a callback function. So it looks like this. Okay, we get access to the resolver object. We'll use this object more when we handle post requests, but I will mention it right now so that way you all can see it. You can see that I have 3 properties: cookies, params, and request. And it's kind of self-explanatory. Cookies is related to anything related with browser cookies. Params, the path parameters. So for example, if I had something like :id, okay, the path parameter in this case would be ID. Okay, so that's that property. And anything related to the request is in this request object. So if I wanted to get the request body, so when I'm making a post request, we definitely want to have access to that. I can do that. If I want to have access to the headers, I can reference that. If I need to, let's see, if we're sending form data from the front end or the client side to the back end, we can access that. There's a lot of things that you can do. Okay. For now, what we're going to do is we're just going to return an array of users, mocked users. And so what we do is we just use the return keyword, and we're going to reference this HTTP response class that we imported. And it has a bunch of properties and methods, static properties and methods. So for example, I can reference JSON, which is a method. And this is what I can use to return a JSON response body. JSON is response body. So if I want to return an array, I can pass in an array right over here inside this JSON function. And then I'm going to go ahead and provide an ID, or sorry, I meant to do an object ID. Let's do name, just like that. Okay. And that's pretty much it. Let's go ahead and continue on. So we have our handlers, and of course, you can go ahead and do the same thing for whatever other endpoint you have. So if you have another get endpoint, maybe something for, I don't know, let's say you want to get all the user messages, you can go ahead and change that up over there. Okay, let's go ahead and go back to the browser.js file. We're going to need to import this handlers variable into this file. So handlers will be imported right up here. We're going to pass that into setup worker, but we want to also make sure we use the spreader operator right before. If you don't use the spreader operator, it'll actually give you a warning. So make sure you use the spreader operator and then reference handlers, just like that. So now this will register all of the handlers for the worker itself. Okay, so now the next thing that we need to do is we need to actually register the worker. We haven't done that yet. All we've done so far was we just are hosting that worker file that we created earlier. Okay, this is that file over here. We created the instance of the worker. We created some handlers, but we need to actually register it. In order to register it, we need to go inside our root React element or React component. And that's typically going to be where you are rendering the actual entire application itself. So right over here, my file is called main.jsx. Yours might be called something else like index.jsx or root.jsx or whatever. But like I said, it's typically wherever you are rendering the entire application, which is this part right over here. And what we need to do is we need to register the service worker inside this file. But the thing is, though, when we register a service worker, it's an asynchronous operation. So we need to handle it accordingly, because if we don't, it's going to likely create a race condition where the service worker will probably register after the React application has rendered, and any initial requests that are being made will fail because the service worker has not been registered yet. So the documentation covers this part, but I'm just going to show you all how to do it based off the documentation. So like I said, it's pretty much going to be this, very similar. And they call this defer rendering, which really just means rendering it later, waiting until you finish registering the service worker and then rendering the React application. So the way we can do this based on the documentation is we can create this wrapper function called defer render Okay. And like I said, this is exactly from the documentation. I'll even show it to you right now, right over here. Okay. All we're going to do is just create this defer render function. This part over here, they're just checking the environment variable. The reason why they do this is because they want to make sure that they are only enabling mocking in a non-production environment. So if the environment is a production environment, you don't want to enable the mocking. Okay, so they just return when the node env variable is not equal to development. Okay, so I just wanted to point that out real quick. I'm not going to worry about that part, but what's most important is right over here where we do a dynamic import of the worker instance that we created. Okay, it's the same exact path, and we return worker.start. So this is the method that actually registers the service worker, but it's asynchronous, so we have to do it this way. So I'm gonna move this back here. So let's go ahead and import that worker file dynamically. So we're gonna do await import and then pass in the path to where that worker is located, which is inside browser.js. And then we're just gonna do return worker.start, just like that. And remember, this returns a promise, which we can then call defer render, and we can use .then because we can't use top level wait in this situation. So we can go ahead and call defer render, invoke it, and then call .then. And then after this promise has been fulfilled, which is pretty much when this worker.start method has completed, has been fulfilled, we can then render the actual React element. Okay, and that's all really there is to it. So now if I go into my application, so let me actually start up the project. So let me just clear all of this stuff out, and let's do npm run dev, and I'll open up the application. So we're running on localhost port 5173. Move that right over here. If I open up the dev tools, what you want to see inside the console is you want to see this mocking enabled text. If you don't see this text in the console, something's wrong. They do have good debugging errors in the console, so you can just copy and paste in Stack Overflow, or you can just post a comment down below and I'll try to help you out. These warnings, just ignore it because they're just talking about these SVG icons, which doesn't really matter. But yeah, so the service worker is good to go. It's working. Now we can actually begin making API calls. We have one endpoint that we are handling. So let's make an API call to the endpoint. So here's what I'll do. I will go ahead and I'm just going to use the built-in fetch API. I'm not going to install something like Axios or something like React Query for something like this. You can if you want to, which I'm sure most of you will. But let's go inside app.jsx. I'm going to delete everything here. I'm just going to return a div for now. I'm going to delete all of these imports up here because I'm not going to need it. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and import the use effect and call the use effect hook because I want to fetch some data, and I only want to run this side effect, this callback function one time. So I'm going to pass in an empty dependency array, and we're just going to go ahead and call fetch. And you need to make sure that the URL that you have or the path that you provided here matches what you're actually calling. So for example, I need to make sure that this is matching this right over here. If you don't, you're going to get a warning in the console. So I'll show you. If let's say if I just did user instead of users in the console, it'll tell me, let's see. It'll say intercepted a request without a matching request handler, because it's trying to intercept that user's request right over here, but there is no where in the application that it is being called. Okay, so that's what I'm referring to. So let's go ahead and put this back here. One really quick thing that I will mention But you can see right over here that the API call is successful. It does tell you, you can expand it and you can see the response and everything else. You can see the response body. So that's good. It's working great. One thing that I do want to mention that could be problematic for some of you is because we are using relative paths, the origin is going to be the same as the React application. So for example, if I go into the network tab, I can see right over here that the request URL is localhost port 5173, which is the dev server of my Vite application. Okay. In many situations, especially when you're developing locally, your API is going to be on a different port because you cannot run the API as well as the development server for your front end on the same port. Okay. So in this situation, using a relative URL, it is okay to use it, but if you want to hit the actual real API, so let's say your API is actually on localhost port 9000, okay? This would obviously not work. So you know what? I'll just do this. Let me actually disable. Let me actually just not. Let me comment this out, and let me just do return. Okay. So if I go back to the console, you'll see that there's nothing related to the mock service worker. If I go into the network tab, for some reason, yeah. So you see, I get a 304 now, right over here. So I just turned off the mock service worker. If you look at the response section, you'll see that all you see is just HTML. That's because the actual response, when you go to this URL, 5173, localhost port 5173 /API/users, I can go to right now, is HTML. Okay, that's what the response is. But because I have the service worker enabled, it intercepts that request and it doesn't return that HTML, it returns the JSON. Okay, so when you are actually trying to target the actual API, using the relative path is not going to work because it's going to inherit that React dev server's origin. In other words, it'll just take the React dev server's URL, add it in front of it, and use that as like the actual origin when it's not the actual origin. Okay, so one thing that you could do is use an absolute path or absolute URL. So instead of doing /API/users, you can do HTTP localhost 9000. Of course, the network tab will say that this will fail because we don't have this actual server running on port 9000 at all. So that's going to fail. But when you have the actual API running, it's going to succeed. The other thing that you could do is you could set up dynamic environment variables. So you could set something up. Where, based on the environment variable, you can change the URL that is, or the path that is being passed into your API requests. So let's say, for example, if the environment variable was something like local mocked, okay, then you can use /API/users. But let's say if the environment variable was just local, that should tell us that we want to use the local API but not mocked. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense, and hopefully you all understand where I'm getting at with this problem, because right now, like I said, I turned off the service worker, but the API call is not working because if I see over here, it's giving us a 304 not modified. This URL is treating it as the actual front end React application. If I had React router DOM, I would see what is being rendered on that path itself. Okay, you can see it's returning HTML and not JSON at all. I can turn the service worker back on, and you can see now it gives me back JSON. Okay, the reason why I'm bringing this up is because I want to make sure that you all are not surprised by this, and hopefully you understand why this is happening and understand the workaround between this situation. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense, but we'll continue to use relative paths for now. So let's go ahead and continue. So I can do whatever I want with this data after fetching it, but the most important thing I want you all to see is that it is actually being intercepted and giving us back the mocked response. So I could just handle this API call by resolving the promise. So I can do .then res and then call res.json, and then that returns a promise, so I can go ahead and call .then again to get the actual data itself. And then if I go over to my console, I can see the array being logged over here. So what I could do real quick is I could create some state variables. So users, set users, and we'll call the useState hook. This will default to an array. And whenever the API call is successful, I'll just call set users and just pass in data. And I'll go ahead and render users like this. I'll render out the name, and I'll pass in a key for each div. And I do have an ID for the user, so that's good. And on the front end, I can see it being rendered out just like that. Okay, pretty cool stuff. Let's continue. So let's take a look at a post request now. So we'll go back to handlers.js, and remember, this is the first element in our array of handlers. We'll just go to the next one after the comma. And I'll reference HTTP, but this time instead of calling get, I will call post. Okay. And I'm going to go ahead and set up the endpoint to be /API/messages, just like this. And this will represent an API endpoint to create messages. So this time in the resolver function, I am going to just destructure the request property from the resolver object itself. You don't have to do that if you don't want to, but I'm just going to do that anyways because I want to. So this request object gives us access to a lot of different information about the request itself. The one thing that I do want is I want to get the request body. In order to get that, we do need to actually call this request.json method, which is asynchronous. So I'm going to need to actually handle this by using await, but we need to add async keyword in front of the callback function. So I'll do async, just like that. Okay, and this is going to return an object. So I'll just call this request body, just like that. And the request body, it's a little bit strange because if you actually reference this, it gives you a bunch of different methods that are for strings, is what it seems. But it's actually an object, so I think we might need to parse this. So I could just do something like const parsed equals json.parse request body. I don't know if this will work. Yeah, it should work. Okay, that's fine. And for now, I'll just console log this before doing anything else. Let me go back to app.jsx, and let's actually create an input field so we can an input field and a button so we can actually send data to this endpoint, because we have this endpoint currently being intercepted, but we need to actually send the request. So right below where we are rendering the users, I will create another div and I will create an input field. I'm just going to create a very simple one. So we will need to set the value of this as well as register an on-change event listener. So I will create some state up top over here. I'll call the state variable content, and the state setter will be set contents. This will just be a string. So the default value will be an empty string. So I will bind this content state variable to this input field. So I'll pass that to the value attribute. And for the onChange, this is just going to take in a callback function. The argument is the event object. We're just going to go ahead and call set content and pass an e.target.value. So every time we type in this input field, it will update the state of content. And then I'll go ahead and create a button, and I'll just call this button send. And we need to register an on-click event listener on this button. And when we click on this button, we want to make the post request. Okay, so I'll call that function on send click, and I'll create that function up top over here. I know I'm not really going in depth too much on these things because I'm assuming that many of you already know these basic things with updating state and registering event listeners, so that's why I'm not covering it too much. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and register this on-click event listener on this button. It's going to invoke this on-send click. It's going to invoke this on-send click function. It's going to take in that event object. We're not really going to do much with it except for call prevent default. What we want to do is we want to use the fetch API to make a post request. So I'll go ahead and use the relative path /API/messages. And once again, you need to make sure you are matching this path right over here. Okay. Because we're using fetch, we do need to pass in a second argument. Because we're using fetch and we're making a post request, we need to pass in a second argument, which is an object, and specify the method. By default, it's a get request, but because we're doing a post request or anything that is not a get request, we have to specify what method we're using. Okay. So the method is going to be post. We need to also specify some headers because we need to set the content type to be application/JSON, so the backend knows how to actually parse it. And then we can pass in the request body. In this situation, we need to actually use json.stringify, pass in the object itself, and then here we can pass in all the key value pairs for what we want to send to the server. So I'm only going to send the content itself, so I'll just pass that in there like that. And that is pretty much it. Okay, I'm going to go into my browser and I'll type some stuff in here, click send. So now you can see that we do get an error, and I think that's happening because we're not returning anything. Let's see. I mainly wanted to make sure. Let's see what's going on here. Did I do this correctly? Content type application/JSON. JSON.stringify. I think it might be complaining because I'm not returning a valid response. You know what? Let's go ahead and just return something and see what happens. So let's do return HTTP response. I'll just return an empty object for now, just so I can see how this works. Okay, so it's still complaining about that. I wonder what is going on. Is this something with this? Because so the payload is right over here. Okay, so I think this is the, yeah, I think it's something to do with right over here. It might be because I'm calling this json.parse. That might be the issue. Yeah, that was the issue. Okay, yeah, so it seems like that was the problem. I guess, yeah, it's a little bit weird, but if I look at the console, you can see it does look like it's JSON, but I guess maybe it's not. So I think maybe what I need to do is I need to do request body.toString, and then I can do that. Yeah, so I guess it doesn't, yeah, I guess I can't. Okay, that's okay. So yeah, the json.parse was the problem. So let's just remove that for now. Okay. Okay, so remember earlier I said I wanted to just simply return back the content. So I'll reference request body.content. Of course, in the real API, you're going to actually want to save this stuff to a database. I will just simply add a simple created at timestamp, and I'll just create a new date object, and I will return get local to local string like this. Just a simple example. So if I now send stuff over here, I get the post/API/messages 200 OK. If I expand this, the response, you'll see the content and the created at property are there, which is good. Okay. So let's go back into our onSendClick function, and we'll just do one last thing. And well, first let me do this. Let me change the status code because it's returning a 200 when it should return a 201. And you can do that very easily by passing in a second argument to this JSON method like this, and just provide the status property and just set it to 201. So now it will send back a 201. Okay, there we go. And from here on, you can do whatever you want with the data. So if you want to resolve this promise and update the state each time you're creating a new message, you can do that. You can do whatever you want. It doesn't even matter what you do with this. The point is that whatever you do, once you turn off the service worker, it's going to call the real API, and it's going to do the same exact thing, just with real data this time. Okay? So from here on, everything is very identical to each other. Of course, there are some things that you might want to do. So I'll show you a quick example. Let's say if one of these endpoints you want to test to see if there's no auth token in the headers, you want to return maybe like a 401 error. So what I'll do is I'll go inside the messages API endpoint, and I'll go ahead and declare a variable called auth token, and I'll reference request.headers. I'll call .get, and I'm going to want to get the authorization token, just like that. And then what I'll do here is I'll just simply say if there's no auth token, I'll just return HTTP response.json. And over here, what we want to do is we want to actually pass in, I mean, it even shows over here as an example. We want to make sure we pass in the message. So message unauthorized. And then as a second argument, we pass the status. This is very important because if you don't do this, the actual API response will not fail on the front end. Okay, so we'll pass in a status for 401. So that means unauthorized. Now, if you go back to this app.jsx file, we don't have any auth token. So let's see what it looks like when I go ahead and refresh and try to send a message or create a message. You'll see that it says 401 unauthorized, which is pretty much what we expect. Okay. And I can see the message over here from the response body unauthorized. If I were to add an authorization token, let's just say token 123. If I click send, now it gives us the 201. Okay, so that's just like a simple example of how you can, play around with the headers, request headers if you need to. There's also other things too. Let's say if you're using sessions, or if you like sessions typically are using cookies, you can play around with the cookies to check to see if the request has a specific cookie, and if it doesn't, then reject the request. So you just have to be creative with it. There's a lot of things that you can do with this, so you just have to think outside the box. So that's going to be pretty much it for this video. I really hope you all enjoyed this. I really had fun making this video. It's, like I said, Mock Service Worker is one of my favorite tools that I've ever discovered, and it's such a great tool. If you guys like this video, definitely please leave a like down below. If you have any questions, like I said, just leave a comment down below. I will respond to it if I can. I pretty much check out my comments all the time, so like I said, any questions, any confusion, just leave a comment down below. Okay? So that's going to be pretty much it for this video. My name is Anson, and I will see you all in my next video. Peace out.